This is the sermon for the fifth Sunday after the Epiphany. We are reading this morning Matthew's Gospel, the fifth chapter, beginning with the 13th verse. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In this way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. What is your name? How are you called? What shall we call you? Some years ago, a member of a choir that I directed asked me, "What would you like to be called?" In jest, I replied, "Well, I'd like to be called Captain, oh my Captain." A few got the joke, not that it was a particularly good joke, but the individual who asked apparently did not, and much to my surprise, took me seriously, and at least for a little while, actually called me that. Do you remember the first time you were ever called a name? Some names are good. Like your own name, for example. In ancient Hebrew tradition, a person's name was his identity. That's the reason that for a Jew, the name of God is so sacred it should not even be spoken in ordinary conversation or written down in ordinary writing. Substitute names are used, generally speaking, when God needs to be referred to. Some names are not good. Sometimes a name can become an insult. You will understand the kind of thing I'm talking about without my needing to give examples. It's interesting to observe that sometimes it depends on who's doing the name calling before we know whether the name is good or bad. What's in a name? Sometimes we are known by nicknames, either of our own choosing or chosen by those close to us. I've known people who prefer their nicknames to the name given them at birth. I've been called names, some that I haven't minded at all, and some that still stir anger deep within my soul's memories if I even think about them. You may have had similar experiences. Today's text is about Jesus calling his disciples something very odd. You are the salt of the world, our Lord says to his disciples. You are probably familiar with the expression that comes from this passage, salt of the earth, as in, so-and-so is the salt of the earth. This morning I'd like to explore two aspects of this. First, what it means to be the salt of the earth. And then secondly, what is meant when Jesus speaks of the salt losing its saltiness. Now, in our age, we might not think much of salt. In fact, we can see that there is, in much of the world, a concerted effort to take salt out of our diets. Salt is often seen as the enemy, a kind of poison. But let's look at this from the perspective of the ancient world as much as we possibly can. What does salt do? Or at least, what was it thought to do in Jesus' day? Perhaps more than anything, salt then, as now, was seen as something to make food more palatable, to enhance its flavor. But then in those days, salt was also a preservative. In fact, salt was commonly used as a way to preserve food up until relatively recent times. When food is salted, for a variety of reasons, it can be stored and remain edible for much longer periods of time. And then salt, at least in ancient times, was considered a cleansing agent. Specifically, it was an antiseptic. Salt was also seen as a salve, a way to stop injuries from becoming infected, a means to promote more rapid and thorough healing. And here we see three possible analogies that Jesus may have been talking about when he was addressing his disciples. Let's look at them in the opposite order in which I have described them. Salt as healing agent. In our age of modern medicine, we might not think much of salt as a way to mitigate infection, but in the ancient world, it was of paramount importance. Salt was so important, it was sometimes used as currency. It is said that occasionally Roman soldiers were paid in salt. The Latin salarium may in fact be linked to the words for soldier and employment and salary. But the idea of salt as salve, is this not what we are called to be? That which brings healing to a broken world. Have we not been called, in following the teachings of Christ, in being little Christs? That is what a Christian is. Do we not bring healing to a world that is infected with the diseases of its own making? If we were to take seriously what Jesus has called us to be, might we not begin, however little by little, to mitigate the effects of this thing we call sin? Now, the next property of salt, as a preservative. I struggle with this one. There are times when I think, why would anyone want to preserve anything? Our world is so corrupt, so filled with perversion. Is there anything really worth saving? Our noblest mental strivings, more often than not, lead to destruction. Our greatest works of art crumble into dust. Is there anything at all even worth preserving? And then there's God. God doesn't seem to be about preserving either. There are many who believe quite literally that once upon a time God became so angry with his creation that he wiped it out in a flood. Except for one family, God destroyed mankind and all of his works, and all of the animals and all of the plants, at least those who couldn't live underwater. And there are those who believe that God will eventually destroy the world again, though this time not with a flood, but with flames. When I was a child, I was told that in heaven we would not remember anything from our lives, because our lives were sinful. And so in heaven, where there is no sin, our old memories would not be preserved. We would not know our parents, or our siblings, or friends, or even spouses, because all our relationships were in one way or another sinful. We would not remember anything we did in this life. No memories or skill would carry over. Nothing preserved. And yet that may not be how God operates. When Jesus was raised from the dead, he did not come back remade. He still carried in his person the marks of his crucifixion, the holes from the nails and the gash in his side, somehow made glorious, dear tokens of his passion, in the words of one hymn, somehow preserved. So maybe God does want things preserved after all, the truest sense of what we are, not annihilated, but transformed into something better, something closer to the truer will of God. Maybe that is another function of those who follow Jesus, to identify what is truest in humanity, to amplify that which is good, to ensure the survival of that which God intends, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, in the words of Paul's letter to the Philippians. These are the things we are called to preserve in humanity, perhaps even beginning with ourselves. And now we come to salt as enhancer of flavor. Why use salt, or any so-called flavor enhancer on food? The answer is simple: to make it better. So is that what you're called to be as followers of Christ? To make the world better? Is that what we actually do? Imagine what our churches would be like if we counted among their primary purpose the mission to make the world a better place, making it more palatable for those for whom life has become unpalatable. Christians as those who improve the world's flavor. Before I conclude our discussion with the inevitable attempt to exegete the salt losing its saltiness, I would like to suggest something that may come across as odd. Not all that many years ago, I would have balked at such a concept, and those who were my first theological teachers might very well have called this blasphemy. But in truth, I believe that not everything can be salt. Salt is good, especially, as we shall presently discuss, when it retains its saltiness. But no one needs or wants a meal made entirely of salt. In fact, such a thing, if taken repeatedly, would ultimately be poisonous. Perhaps, just maybe, we worry disproportionately over whether or not everyone around us is a Christian. Consider the outcry from Christians of all stripes when it was recently suggested in the highest political circles that the United States is no longer a Christian nation. We worry over whether or not our churches are full, and our denominations are gaining in membership, as if we expected everyone and everything to become salt. Perhaps it is enough, if we really understand ourselves to be followers of Christ, to raise the level of saltiness, to sow peace where there is strife, to foster understanding where there is prejudice. In short, to become the righteousness of God, and in so doing, move our world more and more to a place of renewal, trusting that in the end, every eye will behold him. You are the salt of the earth, Jesus says, according to Matthew 5:13. And then he goes on to describe what happens if the salt loses its saltiness. And you may say, wait a minute, how can salt lose its saltiness? That doesn't really happen. Now, I have taught before about how it is possible there's the potential of a little anthropological cultural misunderstanding as we read these verses, and that the salt mined from the area surrounding the Dead Sea was not quite the salt that we understand. And there were certain ways that that kind of salt could lose its saltiness, through contamination, for example. And of course, we can draw many easy parallels. But without going deeply into a chemistry lesson, regardless of what kind of salt we're talking about, and there are a few kinds besides just the sodium chloride we typically think of, salt of any kind can only lose its saltiness if it somehow loses its nature. Sodium chloride, for example, will cease to be salt if it is broken down into its constituent parts. It turns back into chlorine and sodium. Or if something added to it were to change its chemical nature. In short, salt is salty until it is no longer salt, when its essential nature is gone. Is that what has happened to Christendom? Have we somehow lost our essential nature, either because we have broken apart into constituent components, or because something has reacted with us, changing us into something inherently different? Is that why the world seems to trample us underfoot? So is there no hope for Christendom, for the church, for the churches? Is there no hope for us when we realize that maybe the problem is that we are simply not as salty as we should be? Jesus asks rhetorically, how can the salt regain its saltiness? But he does not say it can never be. For Jesus restored the saltiness even of those who willfully fell away, of Peter and the other disciples, of 1,000 million backslidden sinners, even as he does for all those who seek to follow him, daily renewing us and restoring us and nudging us, pushing us, perhaps even driving us along the paths that he first walked, the paths that he prepared.